It's a great honor for me to introduce Yuval. Yuval Ishai is a professor at Technion in Israel. He was named an AICR Fellow 2018 for essential contributions to the theory of cryptographic protocols, low complexity cryptography, and other foundations of cryptography. And it's really a great honor.
Thanks, Gilad. And I should say that it's a great pleasure to be here at the first physical ITC conference. Yeah, so to give a brief summary of the talk. So if you like to talk but don't like to listen, or alternatively, but much less commonly, if you like to listen and don't like to talk, then you came to the right place, especially if you can also find somebody of the other kind. Okay. So yeah, so in a bit more detail, this talk is about the landscape of cryptography in the setting I just described. So we have a sender who can only talk to a receiver, but this talking is done over a noisy communication channel, which enables interesting things to happen. And this question can be naturally subdivided into 4 different sub-questions depending on the type of task we're trying to realize. We will consider simple task of secure communication and later a more complex task of secure computation. And we can also consider the question in the information theoretic setting or in the computational setting. And it turns out that in the most basic setting of secure communication over one-way noisy channels, in the information theoretic setting, we pretty much know the answers to the main relevant questions since the mid-70s. This is an ongoing area of research that I will discuss in the first part of the talk. For the problem of secure computation, we know the high order bits since around 2015. And in general, there is much less research on this problem. But it turns out that despite the fundamental nature of these questions, very little has been done even about secure communication in the computational setting. So while I will also cover the top row of information theoretic security, most of this talk will be devoted to new results that consider the question in the computational setting. In the first part, I will consider secure communication, and this is a joint work with Blue and Sahai. In the second part, I will talk about secure computation, and this is a joint work from last crypto conference with Agrawal, Koshilevitz, Narayanan, the Prabhakaran brothers, and Rosen. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, why do I choose to talk about computational results in this ITC conference, which is a good thing to wonder about. So it turns out that the cleanest formulation of these new results in the computational setting is actually information theoretic. I will mainly describe the results using an ideal model that we call ideal obfuscation model. You can just think of it as the most natural ideal model capturing obfuscation. So you can think of the sender taking some small polynomial size circuit which it generates at random, and it can just lock it up in a box that the receiver has access to. But even a malicious receiver can only make polynomially many queries to the box. So in this setting, in the presence of query-bounded receivers, we get unconditional information theoretic security. And this is contrasted with most applications of obfuscation in cryptography, where even if we assume the obfuscation primitive to be ideal, we still only get computational security and need to rely on assumptions. So this is, for this kind of questions, we get interesting results when we assume an ideal obfuscation primitive. And of course, I will also talk about instantiating this ideal obfuscation primitive. Here also, unlike most obfuscation-based results in cryptography, we do not yet have an instantiation under well-studied assumptions. However, I will argue that we do have explicit ways to instantiate the obfuscation primitive that are likely to be secure. And I will also speculate that in the not too far future, we will have instantiations in the plane model under standard assumptions. Okay, so this is just a very high level overview of what the talk will be about. And please feel free to stop me with questions at any point. There was a question on the floor. Oh. So is it also assumed that parties have two-way non-noisy channels? Great questions. The answer is no. We only allow, the qualitative feature of this model is that we only allow one-way communication from the sender to the receiver. This will obviously restrict the type of things we can hope to do, as we will see in the talk. Okay, great. Okay, so again, the part one will be about secure communication based on joint work with Corp, Blue, and Sahai. So let me start with a bit of history. So since the middle of the previous century, we know that if Alice and Bob share sufficiently long secret key, then they can communicate securely, or Alice can securely communicate a message to Bob by sending just a single message. In fact, here we don't consider any noisy channels, just a single message over a public channel is enough for secure communication in the classical setting, assuming that Alice and Bob share a secret key. If we use pseudo-randomness, we can make the key shorter, but we cannot eliminate it completely. It took almost 30 years for Diffie and Hellman to come up with the amazing realization that in fact secure communication is possible even without a common secret key, but in the computational setting. So the idea is that Bob can generate a pair of keys, public key and a secret key, keep the secret key to himself, send the public key to Alice, and this public key can then be used for Alice to encrypt a message that only Bob can decrypt. Okay, and this encrypted message can be sent to Bob, and we realize the task of secure communication. So if we try to compare the two solutions, the Shannon approach has the advantage of information theoretic security, whereas Diffie and Hellman's approach is inherently only computationally secure, and we can also not hope to get an unconditional result given the current state of affairs in complexity theory. So this is a conditional computational result. The Shannon, so the Diffie and Hellman approach has the big advantage of not requiring any common key. And finally, the Shannon approach has the advantage of requiring only one-way communication, whereas again, it's inherent to the Diffie and Hellman approach that we need two messages. So the natural question is whether there is some way to get the best of both world solutions that combines the advantages of the two approaches. And it turns out that something in this spirit was achieved the year before Diffie and Hellman by Weiner. And the idea of Weiner is to take a noisy communication channel, where noise is typically viewed as a nuisance, but Weiner said, why not take advantage of the noise to achieve secure communication? So concretely, in his model, Alice encodes her message using some probabilistic encoding scheme, sends the encoded message over the noisy channel to Bob, and the security requirement should hold against any computationally unbounded Eve, who presumably gets a noisier signal than Bob. So Eve also receives the encoding, but over a different channel, which is in some sense more noisy, and this allows us to get around the impossibility results. So essentially what we get here looks like the best of both worlds here, but of course we're replacing, the big caveat of course is that we are replacing a computational assumption by a physical assumption. Okay, we'll talk later about why people think this model is interesting, but for now let's just zoom in on this model and explain it more clearly. Okay, so setting up some notation, we denote the channel from the sender Alice to the honest receiver Bob by CHB, and the channel to Eve by CHE. A channel is formally, here we will only talk about discrete memoryless channel. Channel is just a probabilistic mapping from some input, finite input alphabet X to an output alphabet Y. And we will particularly be interested in channels that show up all the time in information theory and TCS. These are the binary symmetric channel with crossover probability P, which just flips the input bit with probability P, and the binary erasure channel with erasure probability Q simply erases the input bit, namely replaces it by a question mark with probability Q. Okay, so these are the two channels that will be used in the running examples in this talk. And the mechanism here is just what you might expect from the previous description. Namely, we have this probabilistic encoding of M to a code word of length L over this input alphabet X. And now each symbol of this code word is subject to either Bob's channel in the case of the honest Bob, or to Eve's channel in the context of the dishonest Eve. And the important point here is that these noise, these instances, L instances of noise are assumed to be independent. Okay, this is the model. Any question about the model? So there are in the information theory literature, there are many generalizations and extensions to broadcast and so on. Here we will only consider these as living in two separate worlds. Okay, so to simplify the question, since in this talk I will mainly talk about feasibility rather than efficiency, the message is just one bit. So I'll consider a toy version of the definition, which considers a finite problem, where the message is a single bit. And also to make things finite, let's not consider any security parameter and just consider the error to be 1%. So there is a 1% error probability for the honest Bob. And there is a 1% distinguishing advantage bound for Eve. Okay, why do I consider the finite version? It makes the definition simpler and it allows us to avoid talking about computational efficiency. But it turns out that you can bootstrap from this simple finite version of the definition, assuming that the child probabilities are rational, otherwise things are more complicated. You can bootstrap to an asymptotically optimal solution where we encode an n-bit message with computational efficiency using a rate, achieving exponentially small correctness and privacy error, and realizing the strongest notion of semantic security that was formalized in this context by Belar, Tesaro, and Vardy. Okay, so if you want to think about the feasibility question, think about this toy version of the problem. If you want to use the result, think about this asymptotically optimal result. Another point is that in the computational setting, we can use a standard hybrid encryption approach and apply a bit-by-bit encryption, a bit-by-bit communication of a short key, and then use communication over a reliable channel that we can realize from Bob's channel and get a asymptotically optimal rate, namely achieving the capacity of Bob's channel. Okay, so this is another reason why we don't care about the typical kind of fine-grained resolution by which this is looked at in the information theory community. Okay, so to give some intuition about how these solutions work, think of, Bob's channel as being more reliable, which results in a smaller uncertainty zone. So here we have a probabilistic code where the green circles correspond possible encodings of a zero message, and the red points are possible encodings of the one message. And from the point of view of Bob, the more reliable channel, the uncertainty zone basically singles out a single code word that tell him that the message sent by Alice is 1. Whereas from the point of view of Eve, there is a bigger uncertainty zone in which we have a roughly equal number of code words of each kind, so Eve cannot predict the message with high enough probability. Okay, and we can formalize this and generalize it to the case where Bob's channel has a higher capacity in the Shannon sense than Eve's channel. And in this case, we can apply, a natural cryptographic approach would be to code the random string S. So Alice will generate and send a random string S by coding it using a capacity achieving code for Bob. And because Eve's capacity is smaller, Eve will have uncertainty about the message, which we can then extract randomness and use it to mask the message. Okay, so this is a simple approach, yet another application of randomness extractors that can amplify, that can take advantage of having better capacity for Bob than for Eve. Okay, so this is a good time to pause and ask why is the question interesting. So if you look at Google Scholar, you'll see that Weiner's original paper has been cited many, many times to date. While many of these works contain or study different extensions of the basic problem, really a huge chunk of them consider the setting that I discussed up to this point. This wipeout question serves as really the starting point of a big area of research called physical layer security, where the goal is to achieve the traditional guarantees of cryptography using a simpler infrastructure and in some sense lighter weight computation. And again, I'm far from this area and I really understand very little about the practical relevance here, but maybe you can judge by the titles of books written on the topic that people consider it practical, like you can see 5G here and other buzzwords. And perhaps it's not a coincidence that some books study physical layer security together with quantum key distribution. Both are alternative models that have certain advantages over classical cryptography, but perhaps are not yet ready for prime time in terms of deployment as a competitive approach to traditional cryptography. In any case, certainly these alternative models have some advantages, and one would argue that in certain settings, they can be preferable over traditional cryptographic solutions. Again, in terms of simpler infrastructure, you can take your phone and come close to a reader and assume that the eavesdropper on the side gets a weaker signal. And in terms of lightweight computation, which in this setting is theoretically possible. But I would argue that this is a very fundamental question from a point of view of, as a cryptographer, as a theoretical cryptographer, I view this as a fundamental question. It is related to notions that have been studied a lot in the cryptography community, such as privacy amplification, that David mentioned, and fuzzy extractors that he also mentioned. But yet, almost all of these over 7,000 works were done by people in the information theory community. So really, we're trying to study this from a more cryptographic perspective. And really, the question that we focus on here is a feasibility question. Right, so what is a feasibility question? We're given a pair of finite chunks, CHB and CHE. We realize wiretap coding. Yeah. And the question is, can you realize the wiretap coding problem? Can you solve it under the simple definition I presented, right? It seems like a finite problem. It's an innocent problem. What's the answer to this question? Yeah, so it takes a lot of pain to find the answer to this question in the information theory literature, but once you do, there are two basic facts here. The first fact is that in a certain situation, this is clearly impossible. Okay, and when do we have a clear impossibility? Whenever Bob's channel is a so-called degraded version of Eve's channel. In other words, it means that the output of Bob's channel can be obtained by applying some probabilistic function f to the output of Eve's channel, or Eve can simulate whatever Bob can see. If Eve can simulate whatever Bob can see, there is no hope to get an advantage of Bob over Eve. Okay, so in this case, there is clear impossibility. What about the converse? Okay, any guesses? Okay, so unlike our initial expectation, this is the follow-up to Weiner's work. The converse does not always hold in the information theoretic setting. And the main take-home of this first part of my talk is that the answer in the computational setting is yes. So in the computational setting, it's an if and only if condition, with the caveat that we currently need to rely either on an ideal obfuscation primitive, as I described, we get an information theoretic result in this model against query-bounded receivers, or plausible but non-standard assumptions that I will discuss soon. Okay, well, let's say that exactly, yes. If Bob's channel is not a degraded version of Eve's channel in this sense, then the answer is yes, with an asterisk.
So you're saying if an adversary can break semantic security, then there is you will find it.
Again, if the adversary can break semantic.
So you're saying there is no randomized set in the sense you define, then secure communication is possible.
Exactly, yes. So if you cannot simulate whatever Bob can see by what Eve can see, then the answer is yes. Yes. So we consider finite channels, finite discrete memory channels with rational probabilities, even with irrational probabilities. Yes.
So if we have two-way communication with if and only if all the information theoretic.
Yes. Okay, so let's try something which is maybe the first thing that comes to mind when you're trying to come up with a computational versus information theoretic separation in this context. So let's use the learning party with noise assumption, which basically says that if you take a random linear code or a typical linear code, and you encode the random message and then you add random noise, then what you get is indistinguishable from random. Okay, this is what the LPN assumption says. And now let's try to use this assumption to separate the two settings with respect to the following pair of channels. So now Bob has each bit, input bit erased with probability 30%, and Eve has each bit flipped with probability 1%. Okay, so the first thing to notice is that here Eve's channel has a much better capacity in the Shannon sense than Bob's channel, right? Eve has a better communication channel, so it's not more noisy in an intuitive sense. So, the random coding approach that would typically work in the information theoretic setting if you don't care about computational complexity would not work here. It would fail in the information theoretic setting. However, under the LPN assumption, a random linear encoding of a random S will hide S from Eve under the LPN assumption because Eve will just get a noisy random code word. And on the other hand, if it's a random code with the right rate, then erasure decoding is possible just by linear algebra. Right, so Bob will be able to decode. Okay, so this looks like a kind of a simple separation between the two settings under a standard cryptographic assumption, but it turns out that it's not a real separation in the sense that we do have an information theoretic solution in this case, So let me first give the solution and then give the high-level principle behind it. So the solution in the information theoretic sense would be not to use a random coding, but to use a sparse coding. So if you encode the 0 bit by an n-bit string of zeros, and the 1 bit by a random sparse n-bit string, say of Hamming weight cubic root of n. Okay, then for the erasure channel, right, we know that with negligible probability, at least one of the bits of the one encoding will survive, at least one of the 1 bits will survive. However, we'll have this noise flooding in the BEC case, right? Because the standard deviation of the noise is square root of n, so the cubic root of n will not be noticeable, right? So there'll only be a vanishing advantage, okay? So it gives us here, under the simple definition that I gave, this is a good solution, which is purely information theoretic. Right, and the key point is that capacity is not really the right measure because what we need here is relative capacity. So capacity kind of tells you what is the best information of the receiver with respect to the best input distribution. And here we just need one input distribution that will favor Bob over Eve. And in this case, this distribution is heavily biased towards 0. Okay, so this is really why the capacity is not the right measure. We need some relative measure of capacity. Okay, so if we zoom in now on a different example, and this will be a running example for the next 10 minutes or so. Now let's look at the case where the good channel of Bob is BSC 0.1, so it flips every bit with 10% probability. And Eve just gets an erasure of each bit with 30% probability. Okay, so one observation is that, again, we do not have this clear impossibility. You cannot simulate Bob's view from Eve's view because if you have 30% erasure probability, the best Eve can do for the erased bit is, for an erased bit is to guess it at random, in which case she has a 15% error probability, whereas BSC 0.1 has only a 10% error probability, right? So there is no way to simulate the output of the BSC from the output of the BEC. But it turns out that for this pair of channels, there is no information theoretic wiretap solution. More generally, this is the general case for the BSC, BEC, so we only get the positive result information theoretically where this 0.3 erasure is bigger than 0.36. Okay, and yeah, this case was analyzed by Nair much later than the original result, but the original result gives this information theoretic condition which is necessary and sufficient for wiretap coding. I will not get into it. I'll just say that it captures the intuition before that we need to have some kind of a probabilistic encoding that favors Bob over Eve. Okay, so basically this is the easiest case where we don't have an information theoretic solution, and yet we can hope for a computational solution. Yeah.
This is what is
V is like, it's called a prefixing. You can think of it as a message distribution, where X is an encoding of the message. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes.
In terms of the basic criteria you were giving earlier, like you didn't discuss it. It wasn't clear to me what the role of correlations between Bob's view and Eve's view.
There's no correlation. They live in separate worlds. These are two separate games.
The notion of simulation here is just like the clear impossibility is that Eve can simulate something that's distributed identically.
Exactly. Yes.
Not.
Yes. 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 Not. Yes. Yes. Yeah. There are two notions of degraded in information theory: physical degradation, which is what you're asking about, and a stochastic degradation, which is what I meant here. Yeah. So in the context of broadcast, you care about the correlation between the views, but here it's just
one-way setting. It's just-
yeah, just one kind of distribution is simulatable from the other in the same sense that we have simulators in cryptography, like real versus ideal, right? They live in separate worlds. Okay, yeah. So if you think about what this boils down to, we're really looking for some kind of a magical encoding scheme that has this feature that if we encode a random message, right, it's a probabilistic encoding scheme, such that if you encode a random message and subject to the encoding to a 10% fraction of random errors, then we do have an efficient decoder. Right, so think of it as an efficiently decodable code with 10% decoding radius. However, if we have a 30% of erasures, or random erasures, then it's computationally hard. We know that it cannot be information theoretically hard by the information theoretic impossibility, but we can hope that it's computationally hard to decode in this setting. Right, so again, it's kind of different from the type of codes we usually use, where usually the case of flipping bits is the hard case. Here we want flipping 10% to be easy to decode and erasing 30% to be hard to decode. And it's a great question to find such a construction from first principles, say from coding assumptions, from lattice assumptions. We know that linear codes cannot work in this context because linear codes cannot give us a gap between computational and information theoretic for the erasure case, right? So for linear codes, either it's information theoretically impossible to decode or you can efficiently decode. But maybe applying, Reed-Solomon codes with respect to sparse polynomials, like sparse messages or some lattice-based construction. We tried many things and failed. Okay, so it's still a great challenge to come up with such a simple construction, yes. No, we know that information theoretically this is impossible. We need to. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't need to be exact, like it doesn't need to be the search problem. You can have a decision version of that, but Vinod, what did you mean by probabilistic?
No, I think I meant, just impossible.
Yeah. You could relax the search problem to decision if that's what you meant, but either way, regardless of how you frame this question, we're not aware of any simple direct solutions. So I didn't understand the concrete proposal, but maybe we could discuss it offline. Yeah. Yeah.
So if there's a bidirectional protocol, can you also take the mesh message of like 1 5
So given obfuscation, the solution is very simple. So I'll get to it in the next slide. Okay, so this is really a fun challenge, and again, try throwing at it whatever coding or lattice tricks you know, and there is really no reason why a simple construction does not exist. But we settled for using obfuscation in a very simple way. So if we again consider this ideal obfuscation model, and we allow the encoding to contain an obfuscated code, you can think of it as, I'll talk about instantiations, but a physical realization would be to lock up a function inside a tamper-proof stateless hardware token, which is shipped from the sender to the receiver, or we can use an instantiation using an actual cryptographic obfuscation scheme. But in any case, the solution, the encoding of the message M with randomness R includes just a random bit string R. And an obfuscated code for the following function that hides in its belly the message M and R. And the function just expects to receive the noisy version of R received by Bob. Okay, so recall that in our case, we expect R prime to have roughly 10% bit flips. And it outputs either the message, if you're sufficiently close, this is how close we expect Bob to get to R with overwhelming probability. And if you're farther away from R, then we know it must be Eve who is trying to illegitimately use the box. And you know, this is known, you know, in the crypto lingo as a fuzzy point function, or you can just think of it as an obfuscated random humming ball, right? So it's a very simple class of evasive functions. And unconditional security against query-bounded Eve just follows from the fact that, you know, even if Eve tries exponentially many queries to the box, she cannot get much better than 15% far from R. Okay, so this is really information theoretic and conditional security given ideal obfuscation. It's super simple. Things become a bit more complicated when we generalize it to a general pair of non-degraded channels. Here, the function becomes slightly more complicated. We need to consider all crossover probabilities and check that they're reasonable from Bob's perspective, and analysis becomes a bit more complicated to argue that what is the optimal strategy for Eve. But things work in a natural way also for the general pair of non-degraded channels. And then the question, of course, is what to do with this ideal obfuscation. So again, one answer I already gave, just consider this as an implementation using stateless tamper-proof hardware. Okay, that's kind of practical. But of course, we want to get a plain model solution. And here what we, something that is sufficient for us is to get a so-called virtual black box obfuscation for the corresponding distribution over evasive functions with a suitable auxiliary information, right? So it's not only that we're obfuscating this random humming ball, but we're also giving to the adversary Eve some very simple partial information, namely the erasure of the center of the ball, R. Okay, so it's still a very simple case for obfuscation, VBB obfuscation of evasive functions. Okay, but then if we use cryptographic obfuscation, then we can just transmit the obfuscated code over a reliable channel, which we can build on top of both channels. Okay, so any questions about this basic approach before I get to instantiations? Okay, cool. Okay, so let me try to be brief about this discussion. But basically, let me discuss a bit this question of instantiating the VB obfuscation from a broader crypto perspective. So we have these classical impossibility results of Barak et al. And then a stronger result by Goldwasser and Kalai. But these results do not hold at all for so-called statistically evasive functions, namely ones where even computationally unbounded adversary cannot find a non-zero point.
BGB is good enough, probably, right?
Yeah, BGB is good enough, but it's equivalent in this context, so it's not helpful in this context. But yeah, BGB is good enough. We can't provably base it on indistinguishability obfuscation. Unlike most of the high-end crypto primitives that were constructed from obfuscation, yes?
You're not saying you probably cannot base it on.
No, in fact, yeah, in fact, in ongoing work with Ayush and Mark Zandri, we have some construction for simple cases, still not for the most general results, but for simple cases. What? Great question, but it's not needed for the simple cases, and we don't know how to use it for the general case. Yeah. But we can still use I/O as a heuristic as Goldwasser and Rothblum pointed out, in many contexts, including this one, I/O is best possible obfuscation in the sense that if some instantiation of the ideal obfuscation works, then any of the I/O schemes from the literature works. So in some sense, this is better than a random oracle. For random oracle constructions, we don't have such a best possible instantiation as far as I know. And so one can use IO candidates from the literature. In fact, even broken candidates are unlikely to be broken in this simple context. So if people are interested in obfuscation research, trying to apply a broken, like the simplest broken candidates with this construction and try to break it. So this is a good way of moving forward. Again, it's an orthogonal route to using a provable construction under IO. It's really taking something which is weaker. And morally, this question seems much simpler than IO, but it's a much more benign and less adversarial setting. Yeah, so I should say that we can view these results, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, as a generic model result. Generic models are generally useful in crypto. We get these unconditional results or results under standard assumptions in a generic idealized model, like the random oracle model, generic group model, and then we instantiate heuristically. For instance, if you have a construction in the random oracle model, we can heuristically instantiate the random oracle by SHA-256. This is used in practice, and even though we know it's not sound in general, natural instantiations of this approach have not been broken yet. And if we want to apply this general paradigm here, we have two options. Either assume a generic ideal obfuscation model and instantiate it using IO, which is best possible. Or we can go to a lower level generic model, such as ideal multilinear maps, including the tweak that captures known attacks. And we have provable constructions of VBB obfuscation for evasive point functions in these generic models, and then you can instantiate it by whatever instantiations are out there. Okay, so this is still a work in progress for the crypto community. Yes. Yeah.
The reason linear functions don't work is because they have no hardness for erasure decoding.
Exactly.
Right? Either you cannot do it at all, or you can't.
Yes. Yes.
How about like quantum quadratic functions? I mean, the point function construction is very nice.
Yeah.
How about the quantum quadratic functions? That would get around this.
But then you don't have efficient decoding.
If you have like these like factors, and you don't have. Sorry.
But no, you have to speak a lot now.
Oh,
Yeah, so basically just hi Tal.
they can simulate what I'm saying. Okay.
Yeah, so Vinod is asking about a random quadratic encoding, and maybe with a McLeese style construction this can work. This would be fantastic. So I'm happy to discuss it. I'm somehow skeptical, but we haven't thought about it. Yeah, well, something we did think about it. Is just an encoding, applying an efficiently decodable linear code to a sparse message. So if you think of this is a simple form of linearity that is non-linearity that is considered in the coding theory literature. And again, I don't know. The McLeese idea certainly sounds interesting, and I'm happy to think about it. Okay. Yeah, so let me conclude this first part. The second part will be shorter, I guess, which is open questions. So the first open question is to base it on well-studied assumptions, possibly IO on which there is partial progress, but maybe much simpler assumptions, weaker assumptions. Really, there is no, McLeese would be a great direction. There is a relation with similar open questions in the context of computational fuzzy extractors, but I think that the fuzzy extractor setting, on the one hand, it's much more challenging because we consider the adversarial, we really, the adversary we need to quantify over all entropic sources. So this is really more challenging. Here we have a single distribution we need to worry about. And another qualitative difference is that here we don't care just about the entropy from the point of view of Eve, but also about the type of information that Eve has, which this is part of the challenge here, is really to distinguish between different kinds of entropy, right? Erasure versus bit flips, which doesn't arise in the fuzzy extractors context where you just care about entropy from the point of view of Eve. That's a great question. Yes, we don't know. To be a bit controversial, I would say that an information theoretic solution in an ideal obfuscation model, in some sense, it's certainly not implied by a solution based on a computational solution based on one-way functions. Of course, we would be much happier with this solution, but in a sense, the ideal obfuscation model, and I think this will be more relevant to the second part. So alternatively, if we have a really simple construction, if it's heuristic, the question is simple enough, the definition is simple enough. If it withstands cryptanalysis, maybe we can develop a theory. Maybe this can give rise to a new assumption that can find other applications. So it seems like general purpose obfuscation should be an overkill, but at this point we still don't have the good alternatives. Okay, so let me have 10 minutes. Yes, so in the remaining 10 minutes, let me talk about briefly about secure computation in this model. This again is a joint work with Agrawal et al. So in the standard setting of secure two-party computation, we have Alice and Bob who have secret inputs and they interact to learn some function f on their inputs in a way that what they can see during the interaction does not reveal anything except the output of the function. And based on standard cryptographic assumptions, we can realize every function in this way. And alternatively, people starting from Crepeau and Kilian also considered this question where we replace cryptographic assumptions by noisy communication channels. However, these results are inherently interactive. They do not use only one-way communication. What can we do with one-way communication? So if it's noiseless computation, the question is that the answer is that not much. The most we can hope for, even in the computational setting, is to do things like non-interactive zero knowledge. Okay, so non-interactive zero knowledge, in some sense, is the only thing we can hope to do in the standard noiseless setting, even when we settle for computational security. And moreover, if Alice is semi-honest, then she can just send the output to Bob, and this trivial solution gives us everything we can hope for in the noiseless setting. In the noisy setting, and this was really studied in a joint work with Garg, Kushilevitz, Ostrovsky, and Sahai. First of all, we can make the non-interactive zero knowledge result information theoretic, setup free, universally composable. And in fact, in the recent work with Agrawal et al., we showed that any non-trivial channel can be used to realize NIZK in this setting. But perhaps more interestingly, we can actually hope to do more. And the reason is that the noisy channel actually has some randomness, which Alice doesn't know, neither she can control. So we can really hope to realize functionalities that take an input A from Alice, randomness R from the channel, and deliver to Bob the output of some F, deterministic F on Alice's input and the channel's randomness. Okay, this captures the most general kind of functionalities we can hope to realize in this setting. And this is meaningful even when Alice is semi-honest. I will talk about this case by default, but our results extend also to the case of malicious Alice. Why is this useful? So we can think of generating puzzles by Alice with a prescribed level of difficulty. Alice cannot cheat by making the puzzle easier or harder. She also doesn't learn anything about the solution while generating the puzzle. We can think of a certified, of a key certification where Alice generates for every user Bob a pair of public secret key along with her publicly verifiable signature on these keys, on the public key. And you can think in the context of money where Alice can obliviously generate these $100 bills with a unique randomly chosen ID that is not even known to Alice and allows Bob to anonymously spend it. It has Alice's signature, so Alice think of it as a bank. This is like a one-way communication to generate an anonymous bill that Bob can spend without Alice tracing it to Bob. Okay, so these are just examples of why adding this extra randomness for the functionality is useful. And it turns out that the general case of FAR is reducible to this simple random OT functionality where Alice has a pair of random bits or random strings in general, and Bob receives just one of these strings chosen at random by the channel and doesn't learn anything about the other string. Okay, so this is the basic functionality that we want to implement, and this is complete. What? So bit OT is complete with 1 over poly probability. Random string OT is complete with negligible security error. Bit OT is only with 1 over poly security error. Okay.
But it's important that Bob doesn't choose which one to get.
Yeah, Bob doesn't choose, and he cannot choose because he's only a passive listener. Yeah. Yeah. So can we realize this random string OT from a simple channel such as a binary erasure channel that erases each bit with probability 1/2, and everything I say will also apply to the other simple channels like a general BEC and a general BSC. Okay, so what's your intuition? Let's pause a second. What's your intuition? Can Alice jointly encode a pair of messages into a bit string, send this bit string over an erasure channel such that Bob will magically get one of the two strings, only one chosen at random, right? Alice, think of Alice as being honest, right? Is this even possible? So does anyone have any intuition? Okay, so the intuition is that it should be impossible. Why? Because intuitively, the more bits are erased by the channel, the harder time Bob will have, right? So this is bad both for no matter how we encode A1 and A2, more erasures means more trouble decoding A1 and more trouble decoding A2. And in fact, you can formalize. Right, so this is really just explaining the problem more explicitly, as I said, right? So it's a joint encoding that has this magical property. And it turns out that in the information theoretic setting, we cannot even realize this functionality, even if we allow 10% error, right, of security error. And the intuition is really that there is a non-negative correlation between any two monotone functions on the Boolean hypercube. And if you consider information that Bob has as a function of the erasure channel, of the erasure pattern, then this is a monotone function, right? That the more erasures we have, the less information Bob has. Okay, so we have this information theoretic impossibility that is based on the fact, classical anti-concentration inequality by Harris and Kleitman, that says that two monotone functions cannot be anti-correlated, and this basically implies, with the caveat, okay, there is still some technical question here. We need to assume for this impossibility, we need to assume that the protocol is of a Las Vegas type, where Bob's output is never wrong, and all the positive results we have are in this model. Okay, so there is still some gap here. But another impossibility we had in this 2015 paper is that even in the computational setting, we cannot hope to get a negligible error. And this is related to one of the impossibilities that David mentioned in his talk for two-source extractors. But while in the two-source extractors case, there is a way to get around this problem, here it's inherent. The underlying intuition is that no matter how you color the hypercube 0, 1 to the n by red and blue, such that each color appears roughly 50% of the time, if you land on a random point, it will have a neighbor of the opposite color with roughly 1 over square root n probability. Okay, so this is an impossibility that tells us that the best we can hope for is 1 over poly security in the computational setting. Okay, so this is really what we target here. And I will end by just giving you the idea for how we use obfuscation to get the best possible solution, namely a solution with inverse poly security error. with a query-bounded receiver. And for simplicity, let's think of a string erasure channel where Alice can send k-bit strings. Think of k as some computational security parameter, and each string is erased with probability 1/2, and we can reduce it to standard channels. But for simplicity, let's think of Alice being able to send strings where each string is erased with probability 1/2. The idea is that Alice construct this obfuscated welfare agency that is given the two messages A1 and A2. Then it generates k-bit strings viewed as tokens, random tokens that are being sent over the channel. So we expect Bob to receive roughly half of them, right? Each token is received by Bob with probability 1/2. The obfuscated welfare agency will ask Bob to display all tokens he received. If Bob was unlucky and received a minority of the tokens, then it will give Bob the first message A1. And if Bob happened to be lucky and received the majority of the tokens, the welfare agency will give him the second message A2, presumably some compensation prize. Does this work? Exactly. So the reason this does not work, the obvious reason why this does not work is that Bob can, after receiving the second message A2, Bob can forget some of the tokens he received, grow a mustache to impersonate a different person in case he runs into the same person in the welfare agency, and then get the other message. So really the crux of the problem here is to have some proof of unluckiness. How can Bob prove to the welfare agency that he was really unlucky and did not just intentionally forget some of the things that he got, as we all do in the real life, right? We all forget about good things that happen to us, even without meaning it. So the key point, and I will conclude with just this basic trick, and it's kind of a simple trick, but surprising, it went against our basic intuition, and I'm wondering if a similar trick was used in different contexts. I'd be happy to get feedback. It sounds like something that should be useful in other contexts. The basic trick is the following. So assume for simplicity that we have 2n distinct tokens that are generated by Alice. Alice picks a random secret test set S of size roughly square root of n. And which message is delivered by the welfare agency will depend on whether Bob claims to receive a majority of the bits from S, of the tokens from S, or a minority of the tokens from S, right? So Bob does not know S. Bob is supposed to truthfully report all tokens he received. But the welfare agency delivers to Bob A1 or A2 depending on whether the number of valid tokens in the test set S is more than 1/2. Why does this work? Okay, so it doesn't work yet. So here too, we can apply the same forgetting attack. The crucial piece here is that the welfare agency refuses to serve Bob if his level of unluckiness is unreasonable. Okay, level of unluckiness is unreasonable, meaning much more the expectation that Bob should get is n out of 2n, and the standard deviation is square root n. So this means that many standard deviations away from the expectations, this is unreasonable, and the welfare agency will just reject it.
Another way about T says what's the intersection, like the ratio.
Yeah, exactly. So let me jump directly to the picture that shows Yael's intuition. So the point is that okay, so there is this danger zone, which is the bad event. So the bad event is when the number of elements received from the test set is very close to the expectation. It's much less than one standard deviation away from the expectation. By anti-concentration, again, related to the robustness in David's talk of majority in David's talk, by anti-concentration of the binomial distribution, this will happen with vanishing inverse polynomial probability that the number of tokens from the test set received by Bob falls into this danger zone. But if we are to the left of the danger zone, namely Bob received was really unlucky, then there is no problem. You can only forget tokens, you cannot make up new tokens. But if Bob lands to the right of the danger zone, then right, he needs to shift to move to the left by at least n to the 0.24. And using this reverse lever effect, he will need to forget too many symbols, too many tokens that he received in order to move away from the right of the danger zone to the left of the danger zone. So you can think of it as some kind of a two computational gravity zones that you either land, except with vanishing probability, Bob either lands on this right gravity zone or on the left gravity zone. Using polynomially many oracle calls, he can't learn the set and he can't pull out of this zone where he landed in. Okay, so this is it, and this is just spelling out the full solution. And there's a bunch of open questions. Here it is even more challenging. It's still a kind of pseudo-evasive functions. It's not technically evasive according to the standard definition. Here it's even more challenging to instantiate from standard assumptions, though I'm pretty sure we'll get there, right? It's only a matter of time. Tight bounds on the inverse polynomial security, unconditional malicious security in the ideal obfuscation model. Currently, we need to go through in a real model, a plain model solution to add malicious security in a non-black box way. Many open questions. In general, I think this kind of indicates that there is more to understand and explore in so-called query-bounded information theory, where you restrict the query complexity as a proxy for understanding obfuscation-based solutions. So thanks, and sorry for going over time.
Question?
So, how robust are solutions to kind of misunderstanding of the noisy channel?
Yeah, so it's a good question. We haven't looked at it explicitly, but I assume it's kind of robust in the sense that, in the context of secure computation from noisy channels, there's been a line of work on unfair channels that give the adversary some control. These questions are more technically involved, but the truth is almost always on the good side, in the sense that certainly slight perturbations in the noise model are not like a formidable barrier.
Right, I guess I was thinking just with these, like one of the protocols you were just talking about with 1 over poly error, they seem much more.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We haven't really considered it. It's a good question.
Other questions?
Happy to talk to people offline.
Let's thank Yuval again.